The Turner household was nothing short of vibrant on this particular evening. The air was laced with the scent of fresh roses, flickering candles, and the soft hum of a jazz band playing in the corner. The lights were dim just enough to give the room an elegant glow, as friends and family gathered around, glasses clinking and voices murmuring with excitement. This was no ordinary night, it was the 20th wedding anniversary of Emma and James Turner. Friends had arrived from every corner of the city, and a live-streamed broadcast made sure everyone could join in, even those who couldn't be there in person. Emma, always the gracious host, moved through the room, her smile warm and welcoming. Dressed in a classic evening gown, she radiated a serene joy. Her husband, James, was close by, raising toasts, sharing laughs, and making sure every guest felt like family. They had become the image of a perfect couple, 2 decades together, seemingly unbreakable. As the evening progressed, Emma made her way to the front of the room, tapping a glass to gather everyone's attention. A hush fell over the crowd as the guests, James included, looked up at her with warm anticipation. Emma smiled, her gaze gentle yet intense, capturing everyone in the room as she took a steadying breath. She began her speech with sincerity, sharing stories of their early years together, of love and growth, of challenges and triumphs that they had weathered side by side. There was a certain vulnerability in her voice, the kind that only 20 years of marriage could give. But as she continued, her tone shifted. What started as a sentimental tribute soon veered into something unexpected. Emma paused, her eyes growing cold as she looked directly at James. The room held its breath, sensing an abrupt change, the kind that causes a ripple of tension even before a word is spoken. "You know," Emma began, her voice steady yet unnervingly sharp, "it's amazing how 2 people can share a life yet live in completely different worlds." James's smile faltered. His eyes shifted, looking at Emma with a questioning look, as though silently asking her what she meant. She didn't look away. The room was silent, every eye glued to Emma as she continued, her voice taking on a steely resolve. "For 20 years, I believed in the life we built together. I trusted you, stood by you, and yet, you had someone else." A murmur spread through the crowd, some in confusion, others already piecing together what Emma was suggesting. She let the words sink in, her gaze unwavering as she looked at James, daring him to refute what was about to come. She took a deep breath before delivering the final blow. "James, tell me, do you remember Vanessa Parker?" Gasps filled the room as Emma's words sliced through the silence. Faces turned toward James, whose complexion had turned ashen. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Emma seized the moment, her voice now laced with a quiet fury. "For 20 years, you've hidden a second life from me. You've built not 1 family, but 2, and lied to each of us. Did you think I'd never find out?" A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. Murmurs turned to whispers, whispers to soft exclamations. Some guests looked at James with judgment, others with disbelief, as the weight of Emma's revelation settled over them. From the corner of the room, a young man fiddling with his phone gasped, drawing Emma's attention. He waved his screen at her, his face pale as he mouthed, "She's watching." Emma's eyes narrowed, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "Yes, I know," she said quietly, though the words carried across the room. "Vanessa's here with us tonight, joining in the celebration, though perhaps not in the way James expected." Across the country, in a different city, Vanessa Parker watched the live-streamed celebration unfold with a mixture of shock and grim satisfaction. On the screen streaming into the Turner home, Vanessa Parker's face appeared. Her expression was strained but resolute. Watching from miles away, she glanced directly into the camera, as though staring James down despite the distance. Her presence, even virtual, was undeniable and overwhelming. Emma stepped back, allowing Vanessa's image to command the room's attention. The room fell silent, every eye fixated on the woman whose name had suddenly changed the atmosphere from celebration to tension. Some guests had put down their glasses, others clutched them tightly, unable to process the drastic shift in mood. Vanessa's calm yet sorrowful face spoke volumes before she even uttered a word. Vanessa began speaking, her voice clear and cutting through the silence, reaching every corner of the room. "I'm sorry that tonight turned into this," she said, nodding respectfully at Emma. "But I think we all deserve the truth." She paused, as though collecting her thoughts, then continued, "I've known James for over 2 decades. He's been my husband, my partner. We built a life together, raised children together. I had no idea about Emma, about all of this." Her words struck the guests with full force. Some of them had known James for years, but no one had ever suspected that he was leading a double life. Emma's face remained stoic, her expression a mask of controlled fury and betrayal. James, on the other hand, looked pale and shaken, beads of sweat forming on his brow as he struggled to respond. But before he could find the words, Vanessa continued, raising a manila envelope to the camera. "I never wanted to believe it," Vanessa said, her voice breaking slightly. "But the evidence was right in front of me." She took a moment, looking down before holding up various documents for the camera to capture. "Here's the marriage certificate, dated 20 years ago. And here," she held up another piece of paper. "This is the birth certificate of our son." Gasps filled the room as a collective shock swept over everyone present. Emma's face twisted in hurt, yet there was a grim satisfaction in her eyes, knowing that the truth was no longer hidden. She had wanted James's secrets to be exposed, and now they were, completely. The guests exchanged stunned glances, whispers spreading as they tried to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the one standing before them. James, his hands trembling, held them up defensively, taking a faltering step forward as he tried to speak, his voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. "Emma, Vanessa, everyone, please. I can explain," he stammered, looking desperately from one side of the room to the other. His words only seemed to ignite the anger simmering in the crowd. They looked at him, not with understanding or sympathy, but with a mix of betrayal and disgust. Emma's father, a tall, imposing man in his 60s, stepped forward, his face set in stone as he confronted James. "Explain?" he echoed, his voice low but seething with anger. "You've lied to my daughter for 20 years. You've lied to all of us." James stumbled backward under the weight of the older man's words, his defenses crumbling. He looked at Emma, but she simply turned away, crossing her arms as if to shield herself from any lingering attachments. Vanessa's voice broke through the room once more, her tone now heavy with resignation. "James," she said, "I kept quiet because I wanted to believe in you, to believe in our family. But seeing this celebration tonight, realizing that you've been splitting your life between 2 women, it's unforgivable." Emma took a deep breath, her voice rising once again. "You thought you could live 2 lives without either of us finding out. You took our love, our trust, and treated them like games." Her voice cracked, but she straightened, determined to maintain her strength. The live stream chat had exploded with comments, as online viewers caught up with the revelations. Emma noticed that Vanessa was still posting, adding damning details one by one, leaving no stone unturned. It was clear Vanessa had decided to end her silence, using this moment to reveal everything. Suddenly, one of the guests, who happened to be a family friend and attorney, stepped forward. "Emma, you know this is more than betrayal," he said gravely. "What James has done is illegal, this is bigamy. And with the evidence of him funneling money between families, it's likely fraud as well." The word fraud echoed through the room, sharpening the atmosphere even further. Emma's eyes widened slightly as she absorbed this new angle. The betrayal had been enough to bear, but the suggestion that James's deception could go beyond emotional hurt to criminal wrongdoing stunned her. At that moment, another knock sounded at the door, piercing the thick tension that had enveloped the room. Everyone turned toward the entrance as a woman in a tailored suit entered with a badge clipped to her belt. Detective Lawson, a skilled investigator known for her ability to uncover complex financial crimes, stepped in, her expression one of quiet authority. "I'm Detective Lawson," she introduced herself, scanning the room, her gaze finally landing on James. "I've been contacted due to suspicions of fraud and possible bigamy." The room fell deathly silent once again. The guests, already reeling from the revelations, were now faced with the reality that James's double life was not only immoral but possibly criminal. Emma stood up straighter, steeling herself as she faced the detective, grateful for the support but heartbroken by the gravity of it all. Detective Lawson approached Emma, nodding solemnly. "We need to ask some questions and review any documents you may have. Mrs. Turner, I understand you found evidence of hidden finances?" Emma nodded, leading Detective Lawson to a nearby desk where she had quietly stored the documents she'd uncovered in recent weeks. She handed over a stack of papers, her hands steady, each document representing another layer of deceit. James's face crumpled as he watched the exchange, realization dawning on him. His life was no longer simply a tangled web of lies, it had unraveled completely, and he was about to face the consequences of his actions. The walls he'd built around his deception had crumbled, exposing the man beneath, a man whom no one in that room, least of all his wife, could recognize anymore. Detective Lawson looked over the documents, her face grim as she noted the financial transactions James had hidden. "This isn't just a case of divided loyalties, Mr. Turner," she said, her voice cold. "This is a serious offense." James attempted to stammer an explanation, his words barely audible. I didn't mean for this to happen," he choked out, but no one was listening anymore. The guests, disillusioned and disappointed, began murmuring their farewells, leaving Emma and James alone with Detective Lawson as the night's revelation finally reached its inevitable conclusion. As the last few guests made their exit, leaving hushed voices and shaken expressions in their wake, Detective Lawson turned her full attention to James. His earlier bravado had all but evaporated, replaced by a pale, exhausted look that betrayed his desperation. Emma stood beside the detective, her resolve strengthened by the weight of what she had learned, her eyes no longer softened by any trace of sympathy. "Mr. Turner," Detective Lawson began, gesturing toward the desk where Emma had laid out folders of documents, "what you're facing here isn't merely a family dispute. You're looking at potential charges of bigamy, financial fraud, and the misappropriation of funds. And judging by the evidence presented, this case could be extensive." She carefully sifted through the documents, her trained eyes catching the inconsistencies that painted a disturbing picture. Bank statements with significant withdrawals, suspiciously timed transfers between different accounts, and regular cash flows between two households, everything pointed to a man who had not only deceived two families but had gone to lengths to finance each life as though he were two separate people. "Emma found these documents on a USB drive, hidden in our home," she explained to Lawson, her voice even and steady despite the surge of emotions beneath. "I noticed discrepancies in our finances, and when I confronted James, he brushed it off as investments gone bad. But it turns out he was just shuffling money between us and Vanessa." Detective Lawson frowned, flipping through more pages. Each document confirmed the intricate web of lies James had spun, a life meticulously maintained across two different cities. Emma had handed over everything: credit card statements, unusual cash withdrawals, mortgage papers on Vanessa's home that were paid directly from an account in James's name. Lawson recognized the meticulous work of someone committed to secrecy, but James's downfall was inevitable. "Mr. Turner," she said, her tone taking on an edge of finality, "this evidence shows that you've been financing two households independently without disclosing it to either party. You've made multiple unauthorized withdrawals, using false pretenses to conceal transactions that appear to be fraudulent." James held up his hands in a defensive posture. "Look, it wasn't like that," he tried, his voice quivering. I was just trying to keep things balanced. It was never about fraud." Emma's patience broke. "Balanced?" she repeated, incredulous. "You think you can call deceiving two families and hiding money balanced?" Vanessa, still visible on the live stream, interjected, her voice steady despite the shock she felt. "James, you didn't just betray us emotionally. You've left me and our kids with nearly nothing because of these schemes. How could you do this to us?" Detective Lawson silenced James with a look. "Mr. Turner, this isn't a matter of your intentions. It's about actions and their legal consequences." She pulled out her notepad and began noting the transactions, marking down figures and highlighting suspicious activity. Emma handed over everything she had dug up over weeks of quiet suspicion, her fury and sadness giving way to an unyielding drive for the truth. Each transaction told a story: a last-minute withdrawal to cover business expenses, which in reality paid for Vanessa's car loan. Another withdrawal was earmarked for a family trip but was funneled to a savings account only Vanessa knew about. Detective Lawson's pen moved swiftly as the picture became clearer. James had led both women on, convincing them of his dedication while silently manipulating their trust. Lawson turned to Emma. "Did you know about these accounts?" she asked. Emma shook her head. "No. For 20 years, he told me he was saving for our retirement, for our children. I trusted him with everything." Detective Lawson's face softened slightly, sensing the weight of Emma's betrayal. Vanessa spoke again, her voice more uncertain this time. "He said the same things to me, Detective. James convinced me that he was saving for our family, that he was just busy with work. I never thought to question him, he was so good at keeping everything separate." James's face had grown visibly desperate. He looked back and forth between Emma, Vanessa, and the detective, his voice rising. "This has all been blown out of proportion. I never intended for it to end like this. Emma, Vanessa, please, can't we just talk?" Emma's voice was quiet but firm. "Talk? For years, you were never honest with either of us. There's nothing left to talk about." Detective Lawson raised a hand, halting any further discussion. "Mr. Turner, this isn't the time for negotiations. You've deceived two families, violated financial regulations, and possibly committed bigamy. You're going to need a lawyer." She then turned to Emma, a note of encouragement in her voice. "You've done the right thing by bringing this to light. Financial manipulation often stays hidden for years. Your courage in confronting it is commendable." Emma nodded, taking in a shaky breath. Her life had shattered in a single evening, yet she felt a strange calmness in having finally exposed the truth. As if reading her thoughts, Lawson continued, "Justice isn't always swift, but with this evidence, we'll ensure that he's held accountable." With that, Lawson began sealing the documents into evidence bags, preparing to bring James's schemes into the light of a formal investigation. Her firm movements were a stark contrast to the scene that had unfolded earlier in the evening. What began as a night of celebration had transformed into the revelation of a double life, exposing years of deception and betrayal. As the detective packed the last of the documents, she turned to James. "We'll be following up shortly," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Prepare yourself, Mr. Turner." This isn't something you can talk your way out of. With the damning evidence in hand, Detective Lawson left the Turner home, leaving a silence that hung thick in the air. Emma looked at the spot where the detective had been standing, absorbing the reality of her new life, one without James, one that she would rebuild from the shattered remnants of trust and love. Vanessa's image remained on the screen, both women staring at each other for a moment in an understanding born of shared pain. Despite the miles between them, they recognized a connection that only betrayal could forge. Emma, Vanessa's voice was softer, holding an apology and a quiet strength. I'm sorry for what he's done to you, to us. But I'm glad the truth is finally out. Emma nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope amid the devastation. We're stronger than him, she said quietly. And now we both know the truth. A few weeks after the anniversary turned revelation, the trial of James Turner became a spectacle in the city. Reporters crowded outside the courthouse, eager to capture every development of a case that was as scandalous as it was heartbreaking. The story of a man who had lived a double life, deceiving two families for 20 years, struck a chord with the public, and the courtroom was filled with a mix of legal experts, curious onlookers, and those simply seeking a story to tell. Emma and Vanessa, each flanked by their attorneys, sat in the front row, their faces pale but resolute. They had agreed to testify, not just for their own sense of justice, but to show solidarity against the man who had manipulated and betrayed them. Though they had only met in person recently, the ordeal had forged a strange yet profound bond between them. James entered the courtroom in handcuffs, his face devoid of the confidence and charm that had once defined him. He looked worn, like a man who had lost everything, and in many ways, he had. His two carefully maintained worlds had collided with devastating force, and now, there was nothing left but the rubble of his own deceit. The judge began proceedings, and the prosecution wasted no time in outlining the extent of James's betrayal. They highlighted the financial records Detective Lawson had uncovered, showing how he had used deception to maintain his double life. Bank statements, transfers, mortgage payments, each document told the same story of manipulation and greed. Emma was the first to take the stand. She spoke calmly, recounting the years she had spent by James's side, the trust she had placed in him, and the pain she felt upon discovering the truth. Her voice only trembled once, as she spoke about the impact of the betrayal on her children, who had been forced to grapple with the reality of their father's lies. I gave him 20 years of my life, she said, her voice resolute, only to realize he had spent those same years building another life with someone else. This isn't just betrayal. It's theft. He stole my trust, my family's peace, and the future we thought we were building together. Her words resonated deeply, and the courtroom remained silent as she stepped down. Vanessa took her place next, her testimony mirroring Emma's in many ways. She spoke about the years she had spent believing in James, the sacrifices she had made for their family, and the shock of learning that her life was only half of his reality. He lied to both of us, Vanessa said, looking directly at James. But more than that, he lied to our children. They'll grow up knowing that their father is a fraud, that he put his own selfish needs above his family. No apology can ever repair that. James looked down, unable to meet Vanessa's gaze. It was clear that the weight of his actions had finally caught up to him, stripping away any remnants of the charismatic facade he had so carefully crafted. The final testimony came from Detective Lawson, who detailed the financial misdeeds James had committed. She explained how he had funneled money between the two families, creating layers of transactions to avoid detection, and had violated not only ethical principles but legal boundaries as well. Her testimony painted a picture of a man whose double life was driven not by love or loyalty, but by control and deception. The trial concluded swiftly. The evidence was overwhelming, and the judge, after a short deliberation, declared James guilty of bigamy and financial fraud. He was sentenced to prison, where he would serve several years, facing the consequences of his deception without the support of either family. As the verdict was read, Emma felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It was not joy, there was no joy to be found in such a tragic situation, but rather a quiet relief. The chapter was finally closed, and James's deceit had been exposed for the world to see. She knew that her life would never be the same, but at least now, it was a life rooted in truth. Outside the courthouse, Emma and Vanessa exchanged a look that carried the weight of everything they had endured. They walked down the courthouse steps together, a quiet solidarity between them that no words could fully express. In the weeks that followed, Emma moved to a new city, a place untouched by the memories of her life with James. She rented a small but cozy apartment overlooking a park, where she would often sit with a cup of tea, watching the world go by. Slowly, she began to rebuild her life, finding comfort in new routines, new friends, and a newfound independence. The hurt remained, but it dulled with time, replaced by a sense of resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Vanessa, meanwhile, focused on her children, determined to provide them with stability despite the upheaval. She attended counseling, both for herself and her children, working through the complex feelings left in the wake of James's betrayal. Her days were filled with work, school events, and the small joys of everyday life that reminded her she could still find happiness, even after all she had endured. One day, Emma received a letter from Vanessa, a simple note thanking her for standing strong in court and for helping expose the truth. Emma smiled as she read it, feeling a connection to Vanessa that transcended their painful history with James. They were two women who had been hurt by the same man but had emerged stronger, each carving out a life of her own. In the end, James's double life had not only shattered his own world but had led Emma and Vanessa toward a shared understanding. They would always carry the scars of betrayal, but they had reclaimed their lives, refusing to let his deception define them. For Emma, the peace she found in her new life was hard-earned and deeply cherished. She no longer looked back at the years with regret but rather saw them as part of a journey that had ultimately led her to herself. And as for James, the man who had tried to have it all, he was left with nothing, an empty life, defined by the choices he alone had made.